Friends, if you are looking for a unique and thrilling movie experience, then you will definitely enjoy Miss Meadows 2015 in English. If you are visiting our channel for the very first time, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting movie updates. Today's video is all about Miss Meadows, a film that is full of surprises, drama, and a very unusual kind of heroine. We're going to talk about what this movie is all about, where you can watch it, and all the interesting facts connected to it. In this video, I will tell you everything from the OTT platforms and satellite channels where you can catch Miss Meadows, to the behind-the-scenes details like the technical department, music, filming process, and post-production work. We will also touch on the budget of the movie, its performance at the box office, and how it was received by audiences and critics alike. Of course, we cannot forget the story of this film. I will give you a short review of the storyline and discuss the fascinating character of Miss Meadows herself. We will also go over the facts about the film, the star cast, and the roles each actor brought to life. You'll get to know about the performances, the direction style, and the little details that make Miss Meadows stand out from other films. That is why I request you to stay with me until the very end of this video, because by the time it finishes, you will have the complete picture of Miss Meadows 2015. So, without any delay, let's start the video. Imagine a prim substitute teacher stepping straight out of a vintage storybook, handwritten thank you notes, tap-tap shoes, perfect posture, and then, with the same polite poise, quietly producing a tiny pistol when a predator slinks into frame. That tonal whiplash is the fuel of Miss Meadows. The narrative is a candy-coated fairy tale wrapped around a vigilante thriller. It starts simply and linearly. A roadside encounter that would normally end in victimhood flips on its head when Miss Meadows refuses the role of prey. From that first tap dance beat, the film declares its rulebook. Manners are armor, innocence is a mask, and justice can be as dainty as a curtsy. Then comes the meet-cute with a twist. The local sheriff is hunting a mysterious killer cleaning up the town's worst offenders. He also can't stop falling for the prim newcomer who seems too perfect to be real. Their courtship plays like a small-town romance. A picnic here, a chaste flirtation there, while the other track of the story keeps clocking up abruptly ended crime sprees. Structurally, it's a conventional A-story love thread threaded through a B-story manhunt, except the threads are the same yarn, and we know it long before he does. Every sweet date doubles as a clue, every bashful smile as potential evidence. The tension isn't just will he catch her, it's what happens to their fable if he does. Enter Skylar, the ex-con who lurks by the schoolyard like a wolf hanging at the edge of the village. He's Miss Meadows' narrative accelerant, an externalized threat that snaps the film from whimsical to wired. Around him, the movie keeps peeking behind the lace curtains of the town to show uglier tableaus. A mass shooter at a diner, authority figures who abuse trust. The pattern is deliberate, a parade of transgressions staged almost like cautionary tales, and a heroine who dispenses tidy, terminal morals when institutions fail to do so. The perspective stays close to Miss Meadows' porcelain composure, so these eruptions of violence feel like intrusions into a fantasy she's trying very hard to keep intact. Midway through, the film drops its most important key. Those tender phone calls to mother aren't phone calls at all. They're a coping ritual rooted in childhood trauma, an early brush with senseless violence that forever fused Miss Meadows' obsession with propriety to a private doctrine of punishment. This reveal doesn't shuffle the timeline, it recolors it. Suddenly the fairy tale diction, the retro wardrobe, the rigid etiquette aren't quirks, they're a constructed sanctuary, a child's rules for keeping monsters out. The narrative doesn't go non-linear, but it does refract. Scenes you've already watched take on a sharper, sadder angle because you now understand who she's really talking to and why she needs the world to behave. The romance and the manhunt collide on the wedding day, because of course they do. Skylar escalates from shadow to abductor, snatching one of Miss Meadows' students and forcing our heroine to march straight from aisle to lair in a white dress and tap shoes, a fairy tale image sharpened into a rescue mission. The sheriff arrives, not as the cleansing force of law but as a man choosing which story he wants to live inside. His choice, to protect her by transferring guilt with a neat forensic sleight of hand, turns the cat and mouse into a pact. It's the film's biggest turn. The hunter joins the heroine's fable, accepting a morally askew happily ever after rather than shattering the snow globe. The coda doubles down on the storybook frame, a baby, domestic rituals, accordion practice, a sidewalk tap. On the surface, that looks like narrative closure, the violent chapter closed, the maternal chapter opened. But the form refuses to nail the lid shut. The final beat echoes the opening beat, Miss Meadows stepping out, perfectly composed, as if the world still needs tidying and she still has the shoes for the job. Some readings say motherhood replaces vigilantism. The staging leaves just enough room to wonder if she has simply folded both into her private code. That ambivalence is the film's last trick. No time jumps or fractured chronology, just a pristine linear bedtime story that dares you to decide whether it was ever meant for children. Seen as pure mechanics, the plot is classically built: inciting incident on the roadside, rising complications through the sheriff romance and Skylar's stalking, a psychological midpoint reveal that reframes motive, a pre-wedding crisis, and a resolution that restores the heroine's equilibrium. What keeps it feeling peculiar and playful is tone and texture. The dialogue leans on quaint aphorisms, the blocking on little curtsies and heel clicks, the danger on sudden needle drops of violence that puncture the doilies. Perspective remains mostly glued to Miss Meadows' fairy tale logic, with brief, practical cutaways to the investigation so we can feel the net tightening. The effect is like being read a nursery rhyme by someone who keeps skipping the page where the wolf gets caught, because in this book, the girl in the good shoes handles that part herself. At the heart of Miss Meadows lies a character who feels like she was plucked out of a children's book and dropped into a world that doesn't play by storybook rules. Miss Meadows herself is an odd contradiction. She's prim, polite, unfailingly gentle in her speech, and deeply committed to manners, yet beneath her soft gloves hides a pistol and a personal code of justice that makes her both endearing and terrifying. What makes her fascinating isn't just the surface-level quirks, the tap shoes, the dainty outfits, the handwritten notes. It's how these are really extensions of her inner world. They're shields, coping mechanisms, a way of maintaining control over a reality that once ripped innocence away from her. That trauma, revealed through her imaginary conversations with her mother, reframes her entire personality. She isn't quirky for quirk's sake, she's constructing a life where order and civility are weapons against chaos. She is layered not because she changes dramatically but because the deeper you go, the more you realize how much she's holding together behind that porcelain smile. The sheriff is the perfect counterbalance. At first, he seems like the archetypal small-town lawman, straightforward and grounded in reality. But his interactions with Miss Meadows start to pull him into her world. He's supposed to be the voice of authority, yet he becomes enchanted by her charm and innocence. His journey is less about a change of heart and more about a shift in allegiance. Does he stay faithful to the rules of law, or does he give in to her fable-like moral system? His eventual choice to protect her secret suggests that he, too, undergoes a transformation. He accepts that sometimes love and fantasy can outweigh hard truth. His growth isn't loud or obvious, but it's pivotal, because without him softening, Miss Meadows' story would collapse under the weight of reality. Then there's Skylar, the ex-con, who functions less as a fully fleshed-out human being and more as a catalyst for everyone else's arc. He is danger personified, lurking on the edges of Miss Meadows' carefully curated world, waiting to drag her into a confrontation that strips away her fairy tale veneer. His menace forces her to step out of the role of whimsical teacher and reveal the depth of her determination as a protector. Through him, we see that Miss Meadows isn't just cleaning up bad guys for her own satisfaction. She is willing to risk everything to protect innocents, especially children. Skylar doesn't transform in the way Miss Meadows or the sheriff do, but his presence shapes their paths, making him essential to their development. The relationships are where the real layering happens. Between Miss Meadows and the sheriff, there's a delicate balance of attraction, suspicion, and trust. Each date doubles as a test. She's gauging how much of her truth she can reveal, and he's piecing together a puzzle he isn't sure he wants to solve. Their bond isn't a straightforward romance. It's a slow, uneasy dance where honesty is withheld until the very last possible moment. Between Miss Meadows and her mother, we see the fragile inner child who never truly left behind her trauma. These conversations reveal the motivation behind her actions. She's not just dispensing vigilante justice but also trying to honor a moral compass that froze in childhood, one that insists bad people must be punished, no matter how neatly they hide in society. Even the minor characters add texture. The townspeople, though not deeply explored, represent the contrast between normal life and Miss Meadows' private code. Their obliviousness makes her double existence more striking. Children, in particular, are vital to the narrative. They embody the innocence she is desperate to protect, a reflection of the child she once was. Every time she interacts with them, sing-song voice, delicate lessons, warm smiles, it underscores why she does what she does. Character development in Miss Meadows isn't about drastic arcs where people end the story unrecognizable from where they began. It's about peeling back layers, about seeing what lies beneath polite exteriors, romantic smiles, and menacing stares. Miss Meadows stays Miss Meadows from start to finish, but our understanding of her deepens as we discover the pain and conviction underneath her perfect posture. The sheriff bends just enough to let love and loyalty guide him instead of strict law. And the antagonists, though not transformed, serve as mirrors that highlight the stakes of every decision. Together, these arcs shape a story where every relationship is tinged with both sweetness and unease, every motivation is wrapped in layers of charm and darkness, and every character is more than what they first appear to be. Katie Holmes builds Miss Meadows from the ground up with precision acting, voice, posture, timing, all engineered to sell the fairy tale veneer while letting the vigilante pulse show through the cracks. Listen to the sing-song cadence that feels borrowed from a 1950s children's record. It isn't just cute affectation, it's a rhythm that disarms everyone around her. Watch how she holds her chin a fraction too high, hands folded like a Sunday school illustration, until danger enters. Then the stillness tightens, the eyes sharpen, and the gesture economy becomes almost balletic. Her tap steps are performance choices, not props. Each heel click becomes a comic beat or a countdown to judgment. Holmes' best trick is micro-expression, those moments when a smile lasts 1 second too long or a blink comes half a beat late, hinting at the vigilant mind clocking threats. She plays the pistol as an extension of etiquette, which is wild and works. The politeness never drops, it just reframes, so the audience laughs and tenses at the same time. James Badge Dale counters her stylization with grounded, unshowy truth. He gives the sheriff a quiet center, a man who listens first, speaks second, and thinks third in long, conflicted pauses. Dale calibrates curiosity into attraction without ever winking at the camera. You can see the arithmetic of duty versus desire run across his face in scenes that would be nothing but exposition with a less transparent actor. He makes skepticism feel tender rather than adversarial, which keeps the romance from snapping under the story's tonal weirdness. When the plot demands a leap, a lawman contemplating a fairy tale, Dale sells it with body language more than dialogue, a loosened jaw, a less guarded stance, a softer gaze. That subtle shift tells you he's stepping into her world, and it gives the film the credibility it needs. As the lurking ex-con, the antagonist performance is measured, not cartoonish. The voice sits low and cautious, the gaze skittery, the smile too thin, choices that make the character feel like he's always testing the perimeter for weakness. Physical proximity becomes his weapon. He invades personal space the way a wolf tests a fence, which ramps up the audience's protective instincts around the children and around Miss Meadows herself. When the character escalates, it's not a sudden gear shift but a steady tightening coil, so the eventual confrontation plays less like a twist and more like an ugly inevitability we've been dreading. The children's ensemble is a secret engine. Their unforced reactions, giggles, whispers, the way they anchor to Miss Meadows' warmth, give her protective impulses a human scale. Kid performances can turn cloying fast. Here they feel natural enough that each classroom moment lands as sweet rather than saccharine, which in turn sharpens the shock when violence interrupts that bubble. Around the edges, the townspeople function as a Greek chorus of oblivious normalcy. They deliver small, sharp notes, bemused parents, wary shopkeepers, a principal with performative concern, that sketch a community eager to believe in appearances. These supporting turns aren't loud, but they create the normal that Miss Meadows keeps tidying, and the contrast makes Holmes' choices pop. Chemistry-wise, Holmes and Dale find a shared frequency that shouldn't exist on paper. Her storybook lilt against his pragmatic murmur creates a comic friction that gradually warms into trust. Their best scenes play like duets, her high notes of whimsy, his low notes of restraint, meeting in the middle on a single sustained tone of vulnerability. Tiny beats sell it, the way she listens with childlike focus while hiding adult secrets, the way he lets a laugh slip before he remembers he's on the job. By the time they face the story's moral crossroads, the audience believes these two could actually choose each other, not because the script insists, but because the actors have slowly braided their rhythms. Even the film's tonal balancing act depends on performance control. Holmes keeps a toe in irony without tipping into parody. Dale maintains realism without puncturing the bubble. The antagonist keeps menace human-scaled so it can inhabit this stylized world without breaking it. The ensemble honors the heightened dialogue by playing it straight, not arch, so the film feels like a fable lived sincerely rather than a joke told at a distance. In scene after scene, it's the acting that converts a risky tonal recipe, cute plus cold steel, into something strangely believable and sneakily affecting. Writer-director Karen Leigh Hopkins steers the movie like a mischievous librarian who shelved a fable in the true crime section and dares you to notice. From the first roadside encounter, she sets a storybook mood with gentle blocking and bright, tidy frames, then lets danger creep in at the edges. The tone rides on contrast. prim manners against predatory menace, soft daylight against hard choices. Hopkins doesn't simply mix genres, she stacks them, letting the sweetness sit on top until a heel click or a gunshot punctures the icing. That push-pull becomes the film's personality, polite even when it's about to misbehave. Pacing is a clockwork of nursery rhyme rhythms interrupted by staccato bursts. Scenes of classroom calm and small-town courtship breathe, giving you time to relax into Miss Meadows' curated world. Then the edit snaps tight when a thread appears. The timing of cuts often syncs with the tap of shoes or the lift of a chin, turning etiquette into metronome. Hopkins keeps confrontations brisk and oddly neat, as if the movie refuses to indulge in messy brawls. Justice arrives like a period at the end of a sentence. That restraint makes each violent beat hit harder because it feels like a breach of decorum. Shot composition leans illustrative, like pages from a vintage reader come to life. Expect centered symmetrical setups for Miss Meadows, framing her as an icon of order, while antagonists tend to occupy slanted angles or peep from thresholds and fences. Hopkins favors clean lines, uncluttered backgrounds, and the kind of shallow depth that isolates the heroine from the world she's tidying. Close-ups on hands, shoes, and handwritten notes are not just pretty cutaways. They're character beats staged as inserts, telling you what Miss Meadows values without a word. The camera rarely chases chaos. It stays composed and lets chaos walk into its frame. Sound is direction here as much as dialogue. The crisp tap of shoes isn't cute window dressing. It's a leitmotif, a countdown, sometimes a drum roll for judgment. Hopkins uses silence as a second instrument, especially in moments when politeness hangs in the air like a veil before being torn. Gunfire is not sensationalized. It's abrupt and dry, the cinematic equivalent of a stern no. Even the way ambient noise drops during Miss Meadows' imaginary phone calls creates a private chapel of sound, a tonal pocket where her rules still hold. The film's dual-track storytelling, romance and manhunt, benefits from Hopkins' steadiness with perspective. She stages dates like dioramas, bathed in daylight and domestic charm, while the investigation scenes sit a shade cooler, more practical, with compositions that allow space for doubt. Cross-cutting between these worlds isn't just logistical, it's thematic, mapping the sheriff's gradual drift toward her snow globe. When the threads finally knot, it doesn't feel like a twist so much as geometry. Two lines that were always aimed at the same point finally intersect. Set pieces are staged with a fairytale eye for emblematic images. The schoolyard is framed like a sanctuary, all open sight lines and safe distances, which makes any encroaching figure feel instantly wrong. The diner incident is photographed with domestic placidity that curdles mid-scene, as though danger only just remembered it was invited. And the wedding day rescue may be the director's boldest flourish: white dress, tap shoes, a straight walk into the wolf's den, an image that balances whimsy and dread without wobbling. Hopkins shoots it with clarity rather than frenzy, trusting the juxtaposition to do the heavy lifting. Performance direction is the glue. Katie Holmes' stylization could topple into parody without a firm hand. Hopkins keeps the performance anchored by letting the world around Miss Meadows play it straight. The sheriff scenes are directed to prize stillness and listening, which protects the romance from feeling like a tonal prank. Villainy is modulated to human scale, a choice that fits the movie's lacquered surface. The monsters are the size of men, not movie myths, which makes Miss Meadows' interventions feel both outrageous and inevitable. Editing choices support the film's moral fairy tale. Transitions often preserve Miss Meadows' composure, cutting on a smile, a thank you, a step, so that the character's code becomes the film's grammar. When the backstory reveal lands, Hopkins doesn't fracture chronology with flashy tricks. She lets knowledge retint what we see, trusting the audience to reinterpret earlier scenes. That confidence in simple linearity is itself a stylistic choice in an era addicted to puzzle box plotting. The movie looks straight at you and says, "This is a bedtime story told in order. The danger is how you feel about the bedtime." Production design and costume are deployed like directional tools rather than decoration. Pastels, florals, and vintage silhouettes create a curated innocence that the camera honors with tidy, symmetrical framing. When grit intrudes, dingy hallways, asphalt edges, fluorescent glare, the mise-en-scene loosens just a hair, the colors cool, and the safe storybook illusion thins. Hopkins uses that visual slip to signal the stakes without announcing them, a director's wink without the smirk. And then there's the moral temperature, regulated scene by scene. Hopkins never lectures, she stages. A courteous hello beside a concealed weapon. A picnic blanket that shares a frame with a police badge. A child's laugh that butts up against the click of a safety. By assembling those images with calm, almost polite precision, the direction invites the audience to do the knot tying. The tone stays light to the touch, the mood stays intriguingly off-kilter, and the storytelling keeps turning on a single idea. In this world, manners are not the opposite of menace, they are how menace is managed. The cinematography of Miss Meadows feels like it's constantly winking at the audience, building a sugar-coated picture book frame while sneaking in shadows at the edges. The camera doesn't just capture the world, it organizes it the way Miss Meadows herself would want. Tidy, centered, and composed, as if everything in her environment should behave. Early on, wide shots of suburban streets and picket fences look almost postcard perfect, drenched in bright natural light, which makes every disruption, an unfamiliar figure, a sudden intrusion, feel like a blot on the page. It's as though the lens is conspiring with her to keep the world orderly, then betrays her whenever chaos insists on walking in. Angles are carefully chosen to match the emotional rhythm of the story. When Miss Meadows is in control, the camera frames her squarely, often head-on, creating an icon-like effect. She looks less like a woman in a dangerous situation and more like a saint in stained glass, perfectly framed, untouchable. But when danger creeps closer, the cinematography shifts, sudden tilts, tighter crops, or shots from behind fences and bushes that make us feel like voyeurs. It's a clever trick, using point of view not to show what Miss Meadows sees but to show how fragile her carefully staged world is. We aren't just watching her, we're watching her bubble get tested. Lighting is the secret weapon. Much of the film is bathed in a golden, almost nostalgic glow that evokes innocence and safety, especially in scenes with children or in Miss Meadows' own home. But when her vigilante side surfaces, the light cools, shadows stretch, and the warm hues fade into a harsher palette. The diner sequence is a perfect example. It begins soft and mundane, the kind of daylight you'd expect in a family space, but when violence erupts, the lighting seems to harden on cue, flattening out the coziness into something brittle and alien. These tonal shifts aren't just cosmetic, they signal the story's flips between fairy tale and cold reality. Some of the most striking visual moments come from the interplay of costume and frame. Miss Meadows' delicate dresses and tap shoes are always lit in a way that makes them pop against their surroundings. Her white wedding dress, shot against dim interiors during the rescue climax, becomes a visual paradox, purity wading into corruption. Framing her from a distance in that moment emphasizes both her fragility and her unstoppable resolve, a doll walking into a nightmare. The cinematography deliberately doesn't go shaky or chaotic in these sequences. It stays calm, composed, which makes the violence land harder because it feels like it's staining a pristine canvas. The use of close-ups is particularly telling. Shots of Miss Meadows' gloved hands, her shoes striking pavement, or her perfectly written notes are more than stylistic flourishes. They anchor the story in her rituals, reminding us that this is a woman whose identity is written in small, controlled details. A close-up on her calm smile right before drawing a gun tells you everything about the character. Civility and menace are not opposites for her, they're partners. In contrast, antagonists are often framed in looser Messier shots, surrounded by clutter or shot at awkward angles, which makes them look out of sync with the neatness Miss Meadows demands. Camera movement is another subtle tool. For most of the film, the camera glides or stays still, never rushing. This choice mirrors Miss Meadows' demeanor, measured, deliberate, unhurried. But when Skylar appears or when a threat intensifies, the cinematography allows sharper, quicker cuts or a slight jitter in handheld shots, enough to shake us from the lull without abandoning the film's polished aesthetic. The shifts are small, but they register subconsciously, like cracks in porcelain. Even the way space is framed tells a story. Miss Meadows is often shown isolated in the center of wide frames, reinforcing her status as someone separate from the rest of the town. The sheriff, by contrast, is usually framed in shared spaces, offices, porches, dinner tables, making him visually tied to the community. When the two come together, the camera balances them in symmetrical setups, signaling a fragile harmony. It's visual storytelling that mirrors the relationship without drawing attention to itself. The cinematography ultimately creates an atmosphere that's both whimsical and unsettling. By leaning on bright palettes, symmetrical framing, and graceful movements, it builds the illusion of a perfect, storybook suburb. But by bending those same tools, crooked angles, harsher shadows, controlled close-ups, it keeps tension alive, reminding us that danger doesn't vanish just because the world looks polite. The result is a film that feels visually enchanting on the surface but laced with unease beneath, a fairy tale caught under a magnifying glass. The editing of Miss Meadows is like the click of her tap shoes, precise, rhythmic, and polite on the surface, but with a quiet threat pulsing underneath. Scenes are shaped to mirror her composure. Each cut lands tidily, as if the film itself minds its manners. And then, when danger intrudes, the tempo tightens by a few imperceptible notches. That gentle modulation is the movie's secret weapon. It rarely sprints, it rarely dawdles. It glides, then quickens, then glides again, keeping you slightly alert even during the sweetest moments because you've learned the sugar can crack at any second. Transitions are deliberately clean, often anchored to Miss Meadows' rituals. A curtsy, a folded note, a heel tap, a closed classroom door. These gestures become natural cut points, turning etiquette into editorial grammar. The effect is almost musical. Scenes end on a polite beat rather than a cliffhanger, but the next scene often begins with a subtle tension, an over-the-shoulder glance, a shift in ambient noise, that nudges the story forward without shouting. Dialogue overlaps are sparing. When they appear, they soften the seam between romance and investigation, letting the two tracks feel like parts of one sentence rather than competing clauses. Pacing maps directly onto the film's tonal duality. In classroom or courtship scenes, shot lengths stretch, allowing small looks and micro-reactions to register. This breathing room builds warmth and, crucially, sets a baseline. When the film pivots to threat, the average shot length shortens, not into frenetic cutting but into crisp, decisive beats, like trimming the flourish from a signature. Violence arrives as editorial punctuation, a hard cut that functions like a period, brief and final. By refusing to linger on aftermath, the film uses omission as tempo. Those polite ellipses, cutting away just as consequences would get messy, keep the fairy tale surface intact while letting the chill seep in. Cross-cutting between the sheriff's investigation and the budding romance is calibrated to keep both threads aerated. The investigation scenes carry a slightly quicker rhythm, with inserts of files, maps, and glances that accumulate like clues. The dates, by contrast, are edited to savor stillness, a pour of lemonade held for an extra beat, a smile that lingers. When the two lines converge, the film tightens the alternation, romantic gesture to investigative revelation and back, so that emotional investment and narrative suspicion climb in tandem. You don't feel jerked between tones. You feel braided. The midpoint reveal about those phone calls to mother is handled with editorial restraint that pays dividends. Instead of fracturing chronology with a flurry of flashbacks, the film lets the new information recolor what we've already seen. The cut pattern slows a hair during the revelation, granting the audience time to refile prior scenes in their memory. It's a confidence move. The film trusts you to do the re-edit in your head, which keeps its surface rhythm steady while deepening its emotional cadence. Set pieces are paced like nursery rhymes that discover a darker third verse. Take the diner sequence. It begins with medium-length, observational cuts that mimic everyday routine. When the threat materializes, the edits shave away excess, jump to sightlines and hands, then land on a decisive, unadorned blow. No frantic montage, no jittery coverage. The power comes from the contrast between calm and cut to the chase. The schoolyard stalkings work similarly. Shots of open space and safe distance lull you into ease, then tighter crops and quicker cuts narrow the corridor until a confrontation feels inevitable. The wedding day rescue is the film's editorial crescendo. The intercutting between aisle and lair is paced to a steady acceleration rather than a sprint, letting iconography do the heavy lifting. White dress, tap shoes, child in peril. Each alternation trims a breath, like shortening a musical measure, until the strands collide. The confrontation itself is cut with clarity, no muddy geography, so the moral stakes, not the mechanics of action, carry the beat. Immediately after, the tempo decompresses, proof that the film values release as much as build. Sound bridges are used like invisible thread to smooth transitions. The faint tap of shoes will sometimes carry over a cut, turning image change into rhythmic continuity. Ambient hush wraps around the imaginary phone calls, and the edit honors that hush by easing in and out rather than snapping, so those scenes feel like sealed envelopes within the flow. When gunshots occur, the edit refuses to milk them. A single, abrupt report, a clean cut, and silence. The rhythm says more than any lingering slow motion could. Comedic timing lives in the trims. A beat held on a too earnest smile, a cutaway just before politeness tips into awkwardness, a reaction shot that lands a half-second later than expected. These small decisions keep the tone buoyant. Thriller timing lives in the restraint. The editor declines to escalate too soon, saving acceleration for moments when it can actually move the story's moral needle rather than just the audience's pulse. Importantly, The film protects point of view through pacing. We spend more time inside Miss Meadows' tempo than anyone else's, which is why the sheriff scenes feel slightly brisker and more pragmatic. That contrast cues us to the film's game, the world as she orders it versus the world as it runs. When the sheriff begins to align with her, the cut rhythms between their scenes inch closer together, a nearly subliminal signal that they are finding a shared beat. Even the placement of inserts serves the flow. Close-ups of lists, notes, shoes, gloved hands arrive like commas, pauses that emphasize, not distractions that derail. They keep the viewer inside the character's rituals, which keeps the narrative propulsion tied to her psychology. The movie never forgets that its pace is her pace. The editor follows her metronome, then bends it only when the story must. If there's a place where the film risks slack, it's by design. The sunlit interludes that linger on picnics, classroom crafts, and small-town niceties. But those lulls are strategic. They stock the emotional pantry so that the sharper sequences can spend from it. Without the slower passages, the crispness of the threats would feel cheap. With them, each quickened cut reads as a violation of the piece the edit has taught you to enjoy. In that way, pacing becomes theme. The rhythm isn't just about speed, it's about preserving a fragile order and showing what it costs each time the tap of a shoe has to become the snap of a decision. The soundtrack of Miss Meadows tiptoes in like a well-mannered guest and then, when the room goes quiet, reveals it's been setting the tempo all along. The palette leans into storybook textures, music box tones, Celesta sparkle, plucked strings, gentle woodwinds, so that the very first cues feel like a lullaby teaching you how to breathe inside this world. Those bright, chiming colors don't just decorate scenes, they establish Miss Meadows' personal weather system. When she's present and in control, the music is crisp and polite, like a perfectly folded note. When the world misbehaves, the orchestration darkens almost imperceptibly, lower strings creep in, a soft drum pulse arrives, harmonies shift by half steps, until you realize the lullaby has quietly learned how to bare its teeth. A recurring motif shadows the heroine, a delicate, stepwise melody that often starts with a single bell-like tone, then blossoms into a short waltz or a skipping rhythm. It's the sonic equivalent of her tap shoes, innocent on the surface, mechanical underneath. Sometimes the motif is played straight, almost nursery rhyme simple. Other times it's reharmonized with bittersweet chords, as if the tune can't help remembering something it's trying to forget. That duality is the character in miniature. The melody says good afternoon while the harmony asks if the door is locked. Opposite that, the score sketches a companion theme for the sheriff that warms the air rather than brightens it. Where her cue glitters, his breathes, sustained strings, a mellow woodwind line, maybe a single guitar figure held like a thought he's not ready to speak. Whenever the two share a frame, the music finds a way to braid their sounds, her chiming cells tucked inside his longer phrases, so the romance feels earned by orchestration before it is by dialogue. You can hear their compromise happen in the blend. The antagonistic energy gets a stripped, human-scale signature. No monster movie blasts, just a tightening coil. Low strings that refuse to resolve, a brushed snare that counts down without raising its voice, piano notes spaced too far apart to be comforting. The restraint keeps the film's fable tone intact. Menace lives in the spaces between plucks and pulses, not in a wall of sound. When the score wants you to lean forward, it subtracts rather than adds, trusting silence to do what volume can't. Silence is, in fact, one of the movie's best instruments. During the imaginary phone calls, the mix thins until the room feels padded, as if the world itself agrees to speak softly. The absence of score there is purposeful. It carves out a private chapel where we hear breath, the faintest rustle, the click of a receiver that may not even exist. Later, when the truth of those calls surfaces, you recognize that hush as a recurring motif of its own, a sound design halo around grief disguised as routine. Moments of public violence are scored with almost shocking modesty. The diner sequence begins with casual, quotidian music, the kind of gentle cue that says coffee is being poured and the day will behave. As danger arrives, the harmony cools and the rhythm thins until the music lets go entirely, ceding the floor to hard, dry effects, the scrape of a chair, the pop of a gunshot. That refusal to swell or editorialize keeps the moral needle sharp. The score doesn't tell you what to feel, it pulls back so you can feel it without guidance. There's sly humor in the placement of source-like cues, little vintage-leaning textures that sound as if they could be coming from a school assembly, a church basement, or an old record player in a tidy living room. These aren't wink-wink jokes, they're tonal wallpaper that deepens the illusion of a world curated to be nice. When darker material intrudes, The score lets those cheerful surfaces persist a second too long before switching modes, creating a tiny lag that's both funny and unsettling. It's the musical equivalent of a smile that misses its cue and arrives after the danger has already entered the room. The film's rhythm often aligns the music to footsteps and gestures without turning the soundtrack into a metronome. A light pattern of pizzicato might tuck beneath a walk to the corner store, a harp figure may crest exactly as a curtsy lands, a two-note figure might return each time a handwritten rule is enforced. None of it is showy, and that's the point. The score acts like etiquette, you only notice it when it's broken. When a confrontation is brewing, those neat alignments loosen, bar lines feel stretched, and accents fall in uncomfortable places, signaling that Miss Meadows' order is under negotiation. In romantic scenes, the music resists syrup. Instead of leaning on grand swells, it favors breathy confluence, two timbres finding common overtones. A flute may echo the contour of her bell motif, then pass it to a clarinet shaded by his warmer harmony. The cue grows not by volume but by density, like two voices humming the same tune from different corners of a room until they happen to land on the same pitch. By the time the characters move closer, your ear has already decided they belong in the same key. The wedding day rescue becomes a study in contrast. The image offers bridal white and peril. The score answers with a glassy, almost sacred texture, sustained high strings, a hint of vibraphone that refuses to chase adrenaline. Percussion stays minimal, more heartbeat than drumline, and the melody fragments into small, insistent cells. As the sequence tightens, the harmony steps down in half tones, each modulation like a stair she refuses not to climb. Only at the decisive act does the music land on an austere cadence, then withdraw, letting the moment sit without triumph. The restraint turns the set piece into character music rather than action music. Throughout, the mix keeps dialogue king and Foley vivid. Tap shoes are granted pride of place in the spectrum. They cut through score like punctuation through prose. That priority isn't accidental. The taps act as the film's diegetic motif, so the composer and mixer leave space for them, shaping cues around the cadence rather than steamrolling it. When the heel clicks stop, you feel it. When they resume, they lock the scene back into Miss Meadows' tempo. Even end credits energy carries narrative intent. The closing cue tends to circle back to the storybook palette, but with harmonies that have clearly seen things. The same motif, a touch slower, a chord altered here or there, a final cadence that refuses absolute brightness. It's a musical shrug that says the snow globe has settled for now, not forever. The score, like the character, leaves the house immaculate and the door unlocked. What makes the soundtrack work is the balance between idea and invisibility. It gives every major thread its own color without painting over the picture. It plays fair with silence, lets footsteps and breath share the frame, and saves its sharpest stings for moral beats rather than spectacle. You come away remembering tunes you can almost hum and textures you can almost name. Bells, plucks, hush, heartbeat, because the music has been teaching you, gently and patiently, how to listen to the story Miss Meadows is telling with her smile, her rules, and her very precise sense of timing. Miss Meadows wears politeness like armor, and that is the film's central, delicious contradiction. Can civility be a weapon? The movie treats etiquette not as a quaint accessory but as a philosophy of control. Every please, and thank you, every folded note and perfect curtsy, says the world can be tamed if we insist on the right rules. Then the story checks that theory against predators and cowards and bureaucratic shrugs. Manners meet menace. The theme isn't simply that kindness matters, it's that politeness, taken to its logical extreme, can become a moral blade, clean, precise, and a little frightening. Vigilante justice is the obvious headline, but the subtext is about outsourcing conscience to institutions. The town assumes safety is the sheriff's job, the court's job, the system's job. The film keeps staging moments where the system is late or timid, then places Miss Meadows' private code in the gap. Each incident raises an uncomfortable question. If justice doesn't arrive on schedule, who's allowed to improvise? The movie never lectures, it dramatizes the itch. Viewers are nudged to interrogate their own thresholds. At what point does relief at a bad person's swift end turn into unease about who decided it? Underneath the fairy tale glaze is a trauma study. The imaginary phone calls to mother are not a quirk, they're a ritual that keeps chaos at bay, a child's bedtime routine preserved inside an adult body. The theme here is how survivors curate their worlds so nothing ever surprises them again. Tap shoes become metronomes for anxiety. Vintage dresses become rules you can wear. The film suggests that the pursuit of order, through etiquette, through ritual, through goodness, can be both healing and hazardous when it becomes the only way to breathe. Femininity as camouflage runs through everything. The heroine's softness is strategic, it makes wolves underestimate her. The tone flirts with the fantasy of a world where lace and floral prints are not just safe but sovereign. Yet the film keeps toggling the question, is she reclaiming stereotypical femininity or performing it so convincingly that it becomes a trap she can't step out of? When danger appears, she never sheds the performance, she enforces it. The message is thorny and intriguing. Girlishness here is neither weakness nor satire, but a form of power with sharp edges. Romance versus duty plays like a moral duet. The sheriff stands for communal law, Miss Meadows stands for personal law. Their attraction is a thought experiment. Can love harmonize codes that disagree about who gets to punish? The film's most provocative beat is not the shootings. It's the moment a man of the law chooses a story where the heroine's private justice is allowed to stand. That choice reframes love as complicity, or as mercy, depending on your compass. The theme isn't whether love conquers all, it's whether love edits the rules. Innocence and its guardianship give the story its heartbeat. Children in the film aren't plot tokens, they're the measure of what adulthood failed to protect. The schoolyard, the crafts, the giggles, these aren't just sweet interludes but reminders of stakes. The movie proposes that innocence is an ecosystem. If the adults don't maintain it, predators will. That idea fuels the audience's split response. Part of you cheers when the wolf is removed, part of you wonders what it costs a person to do the removing and still call herself good. Appearance versus reality is staged visually and morally. Pretty frames hide ugly impulses, polite phrases encase unspoken threats, a town that looks safe contains hard corners. The film uses this doubleness to argue that evil often fits in without smirking, and good sometimes has to do impolite things to stay good. The storybook aesthetic isn't a joke on the audience, it's a reminder that surfaces, pretty or monstrous, are bad guides to truth. The tap of a heel can be either dance or countdown, the same sound, two meanings. There's also a running meditation on boundaries. Personal space, community responsibility, and the line between self-defense and self-appointment. The antagonist keeps pressing the perimeter, doorways, fences, sidewalks, while Miss Meadows enforces invisible lines with visible finality. The sheriff's arc explores institutional boundaries. When does protecting the town mean protecting the person who protects the town in ways the town can't admit? The message circles back to thresholds. Every character decides which lines they'll cross and which they'll redraw afterward to make the map look tidy again. Motherhood, hinted and literal, reframes vigilantism as caretaking. When the story moves into domestic images, nursery calm, household ritual, it tests whether nurture can replace the compulsion to patrol. The film resists answering. Instead, it leaves a theme-sized echo. Perhaps caretaking and patrolling are the same impulse in two costumes, both born from the same vow that no child should feel what she once felt. It's a tender idea wrapped around a hard kernel: protection as love, protection as law, protection as identity. Finally, the movie plays with the ethics of stories themselves. Fairy tales promise that wolves get what's coming. Real-life muddies that promise with due process, mercy, and error. Miss Meadows collapses the distance between the two and asks the audience to sit in the discomfort. Do we want a bedtime story or a civic lesson? The film's message is less a verdict than an invitation to wrestle. Admire the elegance of a world kept neat by perfect manners, fear the places where neatness ignores the mess it creates, and keep listening for whether the next heel click is choreography or judgment. Miss Meadows isn't the kind of film that leans on spectacle or heavy digital trickery, but that's precisely what makes its use of visual effects so interesting. Instead of bombarding the viewer with CGI fireworks, it opts for subtle enhancements that maintain the illusion of its fairy tale realism. The digital work here is like an invisible hand, smoothing edges, heightening moods, and polishing moments without ever calling attention to itself. You don't leave the film talking about the special effects, yet they've been quietly shaping how you see and feel every frame. The blood, for example, is never grotesque or indulgent, but stylized just enough that it feels consistent with Miss Meadows' doll-like world. Practical effects are leaned on heavily for the actual confrontations, gunfire, bodies falling, the physicality of violence, but there's often a digital cleanup that makes everything a little too neat, a little too perfect, which plays right into the film's storybook aesthetic. This is violence that doesn't revel in gore but instead feels like punctuation marks in a fairy tale sentence, sharp and precise. The combination of practical staging with slight digital refinement ensures that the violence never tips into realism so harsh it would break the film's delicate tone. The most noticeable use of visual effects is in the blending of environments with Miss Meadows herself. Whether she's walking through a sunny suburban street or sitting in a garden of pastel colors, the film often enhances lighting digitally to exaggerate the idyllic quality of the scene. Skies feel a little too blue, lawns a little too green, flowers a little too symmetrical. It's not that the world looks fake, but it looks slightly heightened, like someone turned up the storybook filter without telling you. This soft layer of digital artistry is essential because it makes Miss Meadows herself, with her vintage clothes and prim mannerisms, appear to belong to a world just a step removed from reality. There's also the clever use of visual effects to frame Miss Meadows' perspective. The film occasionally manipulates focus, lighting, and even slight digital blurs to make the world look as she sees it. Polished, controlled, almost whimsical. When violence intrudes, the contrast is sharper because the idyllic frame gets cracked. This isn't CGI in the blockbuster sense, it's atmospheric manipulation that bends reality toward the subjective. By blending the practical and digital this way, the film creates a dual reality, the surface of a fable and the undertow of menace. One of the strongest aspects of the effects work is its restraint. Too many films overplay their hand with digital enhancements, but here the CGI exists only to sustain tone. When Miss Meadows pulls a gun from her handbag, for instance, there's no overdone muzzle flash or exaggerated recoil. The effects are dialed back to maintain composure, just as she does. Even car sequences, moments of implied danger, or environmental tweaks are handled with a minimalist touch. The film doesn't want you thinking about how a scene was constructed, it wants you floating inside its peculiar blend of sweetness and menace, and the effects team honors that mission. Where practical effects truly shine is in the choreography of Miss Meadows' world. The tap of her shoes, the swing of her skirts, the way doors open and close or bullets meet their mark, all of it feels tactile, real, and anchored. CGI merely polishes these edges, almost like a painter's glaze over an already solid canvas. The collaboration between practical realism and digital refinement is what keeps the film tonally consistent. You never once feel pulled into another genre or style. Everything remains bound to this delicate fairy tale thriller hybrid. In a way, the most striking special effect in Miss Meadows is invisibility. The fact that you rarely notice where the practical ends and the digital begins is a testament to the film's careful design. The audience is left absorbed in mood rather than mechanics. The visual effects do not distract because they don't want to be noticed. They want to serve the performance, the storybook aesthetic, and the unnerving tension that simmers just beneath the polite surface. It's the kind of filmmaking where the true artistry is in making the artificial feel natural, the heightened feel subtle, and the fantastical feel just close enough to reality that you almost believe Miss Meadows really could walk down your street, handbag in hand, tapping her way toward justice. The set design and locations in Miss Meadows work like an extra layer of storytelling, shaping the mood and atmosphere as much as any line of dialogue. At first glance, everything looks perfectly ordinary. Charming suburban houses with manicured lawns, bright sidewalks, cozy diners, and familiar small-town backdrops. But the way these settings are chosen and dressed makes them feel just a little too pristine, a little too picture-perfect, almost like they were plucked straight out of an old-fashioned storybook. That deliberate neatness becomes a mirror for Miss Meadows herself, outwardly polished, proper, and prim, but carrying darker secrets beneath the surface. Every location seems to play with contrast. A sunny street with flowers in bloom isn't just a street, it's a stage where something unsettling could suddenly break the surface. A pastel-colored front porch is more than just a porch. It's a space that hints at innocence while hiding the tension of what Miss Meadows might do once she steps inside. The production design loves this tension between appearance and reality, constantly reminding the audience that beauty can mask menace. Even something as simple as a schoolyard or a neighbor's kitchen feels infused with an eerie duality, welcoming on the surface but brimming with potential danger underneath. The props are equally telling. Miss Meadows' handbag is practically a character in itself, a prim accessory that transforms into a weapon's holster. The tap shoes she wears aren't just wardrobe pieces, they're a rhythmic reminder of her carefully constructed persona, echoing with every step she takes. The gun she uses isn't oversized or stylized, it's neat, compact, and efficient, much like her. These props are deceptively simple but carry layers of meaning, perfectly blending into the world around her while also symbolizing her inner contradictions. The interiors are carefully selected to reinforce the film's uneasy charm. Miss Meadows' living spaces feel delicate and traditional, with floral patterns, pastel colors, and vintage decor that could belong to a woman from a much earlier time. They ground her character in a sense of nostalgia while also making her seem displaced from the modern world around her. In contrast, locations tied to violence or confrontation are stripped of warmth. Alleys, isolated roads, and stark corners of suburbia that reveal the darker underside of the idyllic town. These spaces create a push and pull, reflecting how Miss Meadows moves between innocence and danger. What's especially effective is how the film uses familiar American small-town imagery and then slightly skews it. A church, a diner, a leafy neighborhood, all staples of comfort and community, are subtly repurposed into stages for moral dilemmas and hidden violence. This use of location isn't about dazzling the eye with exotic backdrops, it's about making the familiar uncanny. You recognize the places, but the way the story unfolds within them makes you look at them differently. That's where the production design succeeds. It turns everyday environments into unsettling playgrounds for a dark fairy tale. The balance between exterior and interior spaces also highlights Miss Meadows' double life. Exteriors, bright, open, seemingly safe, are where she performs her polite, charming persona. Interiors, homes, secret spaces, dimly lit corners, are where her steelier, more dangerous side emerges. The way these environments are arranged visually reinforces the film's theme of duality. Sweetness versus menace, innocence versus justice, fantasy versus reality. Ultimately, the set design and locations don't just house the story, they heighten it. They make Miss Meadows' world feel like it exists in a strange space between the real and the surreal. The production team crafts an environment that looks beautiful at first glance but unsettles you the longer you linger. It's not about grandeur or spectacle. It's about using subtle choices in design, props, and locations to make you feel the tension that runs beneath the surface of this deceptively charming suburban fairy tale. The dialogue and script in Miss Meadows walk a fine line between quaint charm and unsettling sharpness, which is exactly what makes them so memorable. The way Miss Meadows speaks is unlike anyone else in her world. Every line is crisp, overly polite, and almost old-fashioned, as if she stepped out of a forgotten etiquette manual. She never drops her ladylike tone, even when she's facing down danger or delivering cold justice, and that contrast between her refined manners and her violent actions makes the dialogue not just engaging but downright fascinating. It's this consistent style that gives the character such a unique identity, and the script leans heavily into it, making her speech patterns a defining trait rather than just background flavor. What stands out most is the way the script plays with innocence and menace in the same breath. Miss Meadows will thank someone sweetly, recite a moral lesson, or quote a piece of literature, only to immediately follow it with an act of startling violence. This kind of juxtaposition creates lines that stick in the audience's mind, not because they're witty one-liners in the traditional sense, but because they're so unexpected and disarming. The politeness becomes a weapon, softening the harsh edges of her vigilantism while also making it all the more disturbing. The dialogue doesn't just communicate plot, it builds the unsettling fairy tale quality that makes the film stand apart. The supporting characters' dialogue also reflects this strange balance between the ordinary and the bizarre. Neighbors, law enforcement officers, and townsfolk often speak in a straightforward, grounded way, which only heightens the peculiarity of Miss Meadows' speech. It's like she exists in her own linguistic universe, out of sync with modern times, and that isolation becomes more apparent whenever she interacts with others. Even simple exchanges between her and the sheriff carry this odd energy, with his pragmatic tone bouncing off her prim and poetic delivery. That contrast isn't just for entertainment, it reinforces her role as both an outsider and a moral enigma in the story. The script's construction is deceptively simple, but it's carefully layered to create rhythm and mood. It avoids unnecessary verbosity, keeping the lines tight and focused, while still infusing them with personality. There are moments of sharp wit that sneak up on the audience, where her polite phrasing masks a biting edge. For instance, when Miss Meadows delivers judgments in her calm, almost sing-song tone, it can feel both humorous and chilling. The script thrives on this tension, never allowing dialogue to be entirely straightforward. It always has a second layer of meaning, whether it's irony, dark humor, or quiet menace. There's also an intentional repetition in the way Miss Meadows expresses herself, almost like a refrain in poetry. This rhythm creates a sense of control and composure, making her seem unshakable even in moments of chaos. It's not the kind of dialogue that aims for quotable blockbuster catchphrases. Instead, it builds atmosphere, lingers in the mind, and shapes the film's offbeat tone. The words feel carefully chosen, as if each syllable reflects her personality, and that precision makes her lines stand out in their own peculiar way. In terms of emotional weight, the script subtly reveals glimpses of vulnerability beneath the prim exterior. When Miss Meadows talks about her ideals, her upbringing, or her sense of right and wrong, the carefully polished veneer slips just enough to suggest that her obsession with morality is born from deep trauma. These moments are few and fleeting, but the dialogue delivers them in a way that feels both understated and powerful. They don't break her character's eccentric rhythm. Instead, they weave sorrow into the same delicate fabric as her charm. The script of Miss Meadows succeeds not by overwhelming the audience with speeches or flashy exchanges, but by creating a voice that feels utterly unique and unforgettable. It's the rare kind of writing that uses tone, rhythm, and contrast as tools just as important as plot. The words themselves become a performance, and they stay with the audience long after the story ends, echoing in the tap of her shoes and the polite, unwavering cadence of her voice. Miss Meadows is one of those films that refuses to sit neatly in a single genre box, and that's exactly where its charm lies. On the surface, it could be labeled a vigilante thriller, but the way it's executed feels closer to a whimsical fairy tale that just so happens to be laced with bullets. Instead of leaning on the gritty, grim aesthetic common in vigilante films, it coats its world in pastel colors, manicured lawns, and small-town cheer, then lets that bright backdrop clash violently with dark acts of justice. This subversion of genre expectations is what makes it so captivating. It takes something familiar and dresses it in completely unexpected clothing. The vigilante genre usually thrives on intensity, moral ambiguity, and larger-than-life set pieces, but Miss Meadows pares all that down to something intimate and eccentric. It doesn't rely on big chase scenes, explosive confrontations, or grim anti-heroes weighed down by cynicism. Instead, it delivers a protagonist who looks like she stepped out of a children's storybook, reciting poems and speaking with old-fashioned grace while casually eliminating threats to society. This is where the film feels fresh. Its humor and surreal tone soften the harsh edges of its violence, but never so much that the danger feels trivial. The balance is carefully struck, making the audience unsure whether to laugh, squirm, or applaud. Suspense in the film doesn't come from elaborate schemes or ticking clocks. It comes from the unpredictability of Miss Meadows herself. Because she exists outside the conventions of her genre, the audience can't quite predict how she'll respond in any given situation. Will she gently scold a criminal, or calmly pull the trigger without breaking her polite rhythm? That constant uncertainty is a clever way of creating tension, and it makes the quieter moments just as engaging as the bursts of action. Drama also weaves through the story in unexpected ways. Instead of gritty emotional breakdowns or melodramatic confrontations, the film builds its dramatic weight through subtle glimpses into Miss Meadows' past and her strange moral compass. The tension between her fantasy-like demeanor and the harsh reality of her actions creates an ongoing push and pull that fuels the drama far more effectively than conventional tearful monologues ever could. It gives the film emotional layers without tipping into cliché. Even the humor is unusual for this genre. Rather than leaning on dark sarcasm or quippy one-liners, it emerges from the sheer absurdity of the situations. Watching a prim, perfectly dressed woman lecture on kindness before delivering vigilante justice is funny not because of a punchline, but because of the bizarre contrast. The film trusts the oddness of its concept to carry the humor, which makes it stand apart from other thrillers or dramas that might try too hard to insert jokes. What's most fascinating is how the film manages to keep all these elements — action, suspense, drama, humor — coexisting without one overpowering the others. Each plays its role in shaping the story's offbeat identity. The action is sharp and startling, the suspense lingers in the uncertainty of tone, the drama seeps in through character and backstory, and the humor bubbles up naturally from the surreal clash of worlds. It's a balancing act that could easily have toppled into chaos, but instead it results in something that feels wholly original. Miss Meadows doesn't just follow genre conventions or lightly twist them. It practically waltzes right past them, tap shoes clicking, and invents its own rhythm. That refusal to conform is what makes it stand out in a crowded landscape of formula-driven thrillers. It shows that a vigilante story doesn't have to be grim and bleak to be compelling. It can be pastel, polite, and just as unsettling, all at once. Miss Meadows works like a pastel Trojan horse for social commentary, rolling into town with lace and good manners while quietly unpacking questions about safety, justice, and who gets to enforce the rules. The vigilante premise is the obvious doorway, but the film's interest is less in punishment than in the cultural itch that produces a Miss Meadows in the first place. Frayed trust in institutions, the impatience of communities that feel unprotected, and the seduction of fast, clean solutions. The movie never sermonizes. It stages little experiments. What happens when etiquette, that great lubricant of public life, becomes a method of control? What happens when the performance of goodness grants a person's social camouflage powerful enough to act without scrutiny? You can feel the town's relief each time danger is removed, and you can feel the moral debt slip silently onto someone else's ledger. Gender is one of the film's sharpest blades. Instead of the genre's standard grim avenger, we get a woman coded as harmless. Floral dresses, soft voice, ritualized politeness. The movie turns that coding into a critique of respectability, how culture often grants leeway to those who look and sound right. She can move through spaces a swaggering vigilante couldn't, and that access says a lot about how threats are recognized or missed. Femininity here isn't rejected, it's weaponized, exposing the way audiences and characters conflate manners with moral authority. The romance with the sheriff extends the thought, institutional law measuring itself against a privatized, feminized order, and deciding how much of that order it's willing to quietly endorse. The suburb itself is an essay in myth-making. Tidy lawns, church socials, cheerful porches, these aren't just backdrops, they are artifacts of a fantasy America where safety is a decor choice. By placing genuine menace inside a diorama of niceness, the film interrogates nostalgia. Who benefits from a story that everything used to be orderly, and what gets shoved off screen to keep that story intact? The production design turns looking safe into a cultural practice, and the narrative keeps puncturing it with intrusions that reveal how thin the veneer really is. Every curbside confrontation is a footnote on the American dream of the perfectly behaved neighborhood. The movie also brushes against debates about gun culture without grandstanding. The pistol in a prim handbag is a sly emblem of contradiction, care and lethality occupying the same small space. It's not a policy tract, but the image alone asks sticky questions. Do communities feel safer when good people quietly carry power? Or is that just a prettier version of the same fear? The film's refusal to linger on gore registers as a cultural critique too. Violence is treated like punctuation, which is either chillingly honest about numbness or a fairy tale anesthetic that makes hard things go down easy. That ambiguity is deliberate. Trauma threads through this commentary like a hidden stitch. The imaginary phone calls, the compulsive rituals, the insistence on perfect manners, these aren't quirks so much as coping strategies turned ideology. The film sidesteps therapeutic speeches and shows how private pain can harden into a public ethic, order at all costs, because chaos once took everything. In a culture that increasingly narrates identity through harm, Miss Meadows raises a bristly question. When does healing by control become a system that controls everyone else? There's a civic parable tucked into the bystanders, office doors, and PTA smiles. People in the film want safety outsourced, preferably to someone they don't have to see do the messy parts. That dynamic feels very contemporary. Admiration for results, discomfort with process, and a willingness to let certain kinds of people bend rules if they restore calm. The sheriff's late choice discretion is culture in microcosm, an institution deciding that the letter of the law can yield to the story the town wants to believe about itself. Even the comedy is doing social work. The absurdity of a schoolteacher reciting niceties while dispatching predators isn't just a tonal trick, it's a satire of performative civility, how a culture can use politeness to muffle alarm bells. The laughs come with an aftertaste. Were we charmed into not noticing the line being crossed, or did the charm make the crossing seem righteous? That lingering self-interrogation is where the commentary lands hardest, not as a lecture but as a mirror, inviting the audience to examine which costumes of goodness they trust, which shortcuts to justice they'll tolerate, and how much pretty packaging it takes to make a hard act feel like a tidy solution. Miss Meadows is the kind of film that sneaks up on its audience in ways they don't fully expect. On the surface, it feels like a whimsical, almost storybook experience, but then the darker layers creep in and suddenly viewers find themselves reacting with a mix of fascination, discomfort, and even admiration. The emotional engagement comes less from grandiose spectacle and more from the odd contradiction of what they're watching. A dainty schoolteacher with perfect manners calmly walking through scenarios that would send most people into a panic. That contrast alone creates a kind of tension that keeps audiences glued, because they're constantly asking themselves whether they should be charmed, horrified, or both. The film plays with shock in subtle but effective ways. It doesn't rely on jump scares or loud, aggressive tactics to jolt the audience. Instead, it unsettles with calmness in the face of violence. When Miss Meadows reacts to danger with a gentle smile or an almost childlike calm, viewers feel a shiver of unease. That kind of emotional pull isn't about sudden adrenaline but about the creeping realization that this world doesn't follow the usual emotional rules. You laugh nervously at her quirks, then moments later feel disturbed by the matter-of-fact way she dispatches threats. That whiplash keeps the audience off balance, and that's part of the fun. There are also moments of genuine sweetness that resonate in ways audiences don't always anticipate. Scenes where Miss Meadows interacts with children, for instance, or shares polite exchanges with neighbors, highlight her nurturing side and remind viewers of the innocence she seems to represent. Those lighter beats give the film warmth, but they also amplify the darker moments, making them feel sharper and more impactful. That emotional contrast pulls the audience into a roller coaster of moods, never quite letting them settle comfortably. What makes the engagement even more interesting is that the film seems to invite conversation as much as raw emotional reaction. It's one of those stories that leaves people wanting to unpack what they've just seen. Viewers might find themselves debating whether Miss Meadows is a hero or a menace, or whether the film's light-hearted tone makes her actions more forgivable or even more chilling. That kind of lingering curiosity ensures the movie doesn't just end when the credits roll. It keeps bouncing around in people's minds, leading to conversations long after. For some audiences, the whimsical style combined with bursts of violence creates a strange allure that makes them want to rewatch. You catch little details you missed the first time, or you find yourself rethinking earlier scenes once you know where the story is heading. That rewatchability isn't about spectacle or twists, but about tone, the way the film blends its contradictions so smoothly that it invites deeper reflection. Most importantly, the film has the ability to provoke both strong emotional reactions and intellectual engagement at the same time. It makes you laugh when you don't expect to, then unsettles you just as quickly, all while leaving you with questions you can't shake off. That balance between charm and unease, between entertainment and provocation, ensures that audiences don't just watch passively. They engage, they react, and they remember. If you lined up the vigilante canon from grim classics to glossy reinventions, Miss Meadows would be the one in tap shoes, smiling sweetly while rewriting the rulebook. Where the genre usually wears leather, stubble, and trauma like a badge, this film swaps in floral prints and a schoolteacher's poise. It borrows the spine of a personal justice thriller but wraps it in a storybook shell, turning familiar beats into fable. That alone sets it apart from the gritted teeth tradition of Death Wish, The Brave One, or Peppermint, which trade in urban grit and moral corrosion. Miss Meadows isn't interested in grime, it's interested in polish, and what happens when the polish refuses to chip. Stack it next to Promising Young Woman and the kinship is clear, a pastel palette, a woman steering her own brand of justice, a tone that dares you to laugh and wince in the same breath. But the energies diverge. Promising Young Woman jabs at contemporary culture with barbed satire and verbal confrontation. Miss Meadows drifts toward fable, letting etiquette do the talking and gunshots land like punctuation rather than exclamation. One weaponizes awkward silences in modern spaces, the other weaponizes old-fashioned manners in small-town dioramas. Both subvert genre, but Miss Meadows floats where Promising Young Woman squares up. Line it beside Kick-Ass, Super, or God Bless America and you'll see another fork in the road. Those films scream their satire, they sprawl, rant, and go pop-operatic with violence. Miss Meadows is the quiet cousin, the joke is in the dissonance, not the punchline. It doesn't build elaborate set pieces or editorial montages of societal rot. It trims. It tidies. It lands swift judgments inside frames so tidy they verge on surreal. The comedy comes from the gap between tone and deed, not from quips or shock-for-shock sake spectacle. If Hannah and Lyon, the professional, are fairy tales with knives, Miss Meadows is a bedtime rhyme with a sidearm. Hannah pushes kinetic coming-of-age myth, Lyon braids mentorship and melancholy. Miss Meadows replaces kineticism with ritual. The taps, the notes, the curtsies, these are formal patterns the movie edits to, turning action into etiquette. Instead of deepening intimacy through found family or mentor bonds, it courts a romance with the law itself, a sheriff who becomes the audience's stand-in, measuring whether this fable can survive contact with reality. Hard Candy and The Brave One explore trauma with clinical intensity and moral interrogation. Miss Meadows acknowledges trauma but refuses the clinical posture. It stays inside a constructed innocence and tests how long that illusion can govern a messy world. Where those films grind tension through confrontation and debate, this one chooses poise. It's a deliberate aesthetic gamble, suspense by decorum. You don't bite your nails because a plan is unraveling, you bite them because the smile isn't. On the suburban spectrum, think Edward Scissorhands and Blue Velvet as two poles, storybook suburbia and Nightmare Beneath the Lawn. Miss Meadows sits closer to the former in look but borrows the latter's thesis that rot loves a white picket fence. It doesn't plunge into baroque depravity, it lets ugliness step politely into the frame, then escorts it out. That gentility is the novelty. Most thrillers thrive on mess. This one insists on neatness, making each breach feel like a stain on doilies rather than blood on concrete. Compared to franchise vigilantes, the equalizers, punishers, and assorted caped arbiters, Miss Meadows is purposefully small-scale. No mythology, no rogues gallery, no escalation to operatic mayhem. Its world stays local, its threats human-sized, its resolutions unadorned. That restraint is the point. The film lowers the volume on spectacle to raise the signal on tone, ethics, and performance. It doesn't chase the satisfaction of a franchise button, it lingers on the discomfort of a fairy tale that keeps coming true. Within the broader dark comedy thriller lane, it dodges two common traps. It doesn't wink itself into parody, and it doesn't sermonize itself into homework. Instead, it threads a narrow path where humor bubbles up from dissonance, suspense breathes through stillness, and drama hangs on the audience's moral calculus. Fresh ideas arrive not as plot inventions but as tonal engineering, manners as menace, ritual as rhythm, decor as defense. As for the director's lane, this isn't part of a recurring sandbox or a stylistic franchise. It reads like a tonal one-off, a filmmaker committing fully to a high-wire pitch and building a visual grammar to match. In a market where vigilantes usually scowl and bleed across concrete, Miss Meadows curtsies and cleans the edges. Measured against its peers, that's the film's newness. It doesn't try to outshock or outmuscle the genre. It outmanners it, and in doing so, redefines how a vigilante story can look, sound, and feel. Miss Meadows runs on cymbals the way a music box runs on a winding key. Start with the tap shoes. They aren't just cute footwear, they're a metronome for control. Every click maps her inner order onto chaotic spaces, sidewalks, school corridors, even crime scenes. In quiet moments the taps read as dance, but when danger enters they harden into a countdown, turning etiquette into a timer. That dual function, lullaby rhythm plus approaching verdict, lets the film hold whimsy and menace in the same sound. The gloves are boundaries you can see. They keep fingerprints off surfaces and feelings off skin, drawing a clean line between Miss Meadows and the mess she's willing to correct. They function as armor disguised as decorum. When she removes them, the moment lands like a curtain parting. When she keeps them on, judgment stays sterile, unsoiled by intimacy or doubt. The movie's morality is in those seams, purity maintained by separation, justice delivered without smudge. Her handbag is a portable thesis. On the outside, it's prim and delicate. On the inside, it stores decisive force. The image fuses two cultural scripts, nurturing femininity and coercive power, into one prop. It's Mary Poppins by way of frontier law, a domestic accessory repurposed as a tool of order. Each time the bag opens, the film peeks at the gap between how danger expects power to appear and how power actually arrives. Costume is camouflage and manifesto. Pastel dresses, floral prints, tidy cardigans. These don't only say, good manners, they advertise harmlessness so convincingly that predators underestimate her. The palette makes a pact with the camera. Keep frames bright and symmetrical so the world looks governable, then let an act of violence enter as a blemish on perfection. By treating color and silhouette as a rulebook, the film shows femininity weaponized not by abandoning softness but by enforcing it. Those handwritten notes and thank yous are ritualized lawmaking. Miss Meadows writes in careful loops because she believes in rules you can read and touch. Each note is a civics lesson in miniature, codified courtesy, consequences implied. The script uses her pen like a gavel. The neatness of the line becomes proof that order can be chosen and practiced, not merely demanded. The imaginary phone calls to mother are the movie's most delicate symbol, a private courtroom where grief presides. The phone becomes a reliquary, a device that contains a vanished voice, allowing her to consult an authority who is always kind and always agrees that monsters must be stopped. The sound design turns these scenes into padded rooms, as if reality itself steps aside for a ritual that keeps panic from spilling. Later, when the truth of those calls recolors earlier scenes, the phone reveals itself as both comfort and commandment, self-soothing that doubles as moral marching orders. Liminal spaces carry a lot of weight. Porches, sidewalks, thresholds, fences. Predators test these borders. Miss Meadows patrols them. The schoolyard, framed with open sight lines and neat perimeters, reads as a sanctuary whose geometry she vows to protect. The diner's everyday clatter turns sacred by violation, proving how quickly safe spaces become trial rooms. The film's argument about community responsibility is staged at these edges, where private life and public duty touch. Iconography piles up around the romance with the sheriff. His badge and her tap shoes shine with the same ceremonial polish. Two kinds of order, two kinds of oath. When their paths braid, the visuals suggest a marriage of systems. Institutional authority deciding whether it can live with personal justice. The image of a white dress moving through darkness during the rescue sequence is a blunt yet effective metaphor. Purity entering corruption, ritual marching into danger without shedding grace. Flora and fauna cues whisper under the dialogue. Tidy gardens, clipped hedges, curated blossoms, nature arranged to behave, mirror a psyche that refuses randomness. Birdsongs and pastel petals make a world that looks teachable. The moment a weed of menace pushes through, the frame becomes a before and after lesson in maintenance. Beauty is not simply pretty, it is proof of vigilance. Composition turns symbolism into grammar. Centered, symmetrical frames cast Miss Meadows as a saintly icon, a picture you might hang in a classroom to remind children to sit up straight. When trouble slides in, the camera tips or fragments the symmetry, as if the picture frame can't contain misbehavior. The return to centeredness after a confrontation plays like a moral reset, the world, tidied. Sound motifs bind the metaphors. Celesta twinkles and pizzicato strings act like lace you can hear, while dry, unsentimental gunshots slice through the fabric. The music box sonority isn't just aesthetic, it's a metaphor for learned behavior wound tight by trauma. The tune repeats because that's how she stays intact. When the score thins to near silence around the phone calls, the absence becomes its own symbol, a hush where rules are written. Even scale is metaphor. Threats remain local, human-sized, deliberately refusing the operatic. By keeping violence neat and contained, the film literalizes its thesis. Evil often hides in plain, manageable forms, and order is maintained by small, relentless acts. No supervillains, no grand conspiracies, just wolves who look like neighbors, and a shepherd who looks like a Sunday school illustration. Finally, there's the fairy tale scaffold, storybook diction, moral tidiness, wolves and rescuers, a closing tableau that looks like a happily ever after. These aren't pastiche flourishes, they are the movie's lab equipment. By pouring adult dread into a child's narrative mold, the film tests how much reality a fable can hold before it cracks. Each recurring motif, the taps, the gloves, the notes, the thresholds, acts like a measuring line, showing where decorum ends and necessity begins. The metaphors don't sit on top of the story, they do the lifting, giving us a way to read a pastel world as a map of boundaries, vows, and the cost of keeping bad things outside the fence. Miss Meadows isn't part of a franchise, and that feels intentional. It's built like a sealed snow globe, a tiny, complete world with its own rules. Tap shoes as metronome, pastel suburbia as battleground, politeness as armor, meant to be held up and examined rather than expanded into sequels. The character's mystery is part of the magic. Once you start cataloging backstory or building a rogues gallery, the fable turns procedural. If you imagine a series at all, the only version that preserves the tone would be an anthology of tidy moral parables. New towns, new wolves, the same porcelain guardian gliding in and out without disturbing the doilies. Even that risks answering questions the film is smarter for leaving open. Historically, the movie isn't reenacting a time period, but it plays a stylish game with cultural memory. Its aesthetic borrows the manners and silhouettes of a mid-century America that never really existed outside advertisements and etiquette guides. The floral dresses, the crisp handwriting, the clipped lawns, these evoke a 1950s ideal of order that the story then subjects to stress tests. That curated, yesteryear atmosphere isn't nostalgia, it's a lens. By staging modern threats inside a make-believe past, the film says something sly about how communities mythologize safety and civility, and how those myths can both comfort and mislead. In the broader lineage of vigilante stories, Miss Meadows sidesteps the leather and stubble tradition in favor of fairy tale logic. Think of it as a cousin to the female-driven Avenger cycle that runs from Ms. 45 through Hard Candy to more recent candy-coated provocations, but with its voice turned to a whisper instead of a shout. Where many entries lean into grime and catharsis, this one chooses polish and poise, making the moral friction feel stranger and, in some ways, stickier. It doesn't present a manifesto, it stages a parable and lets the audience do the debating in the car ride home. Contextually, the film lands in the early 2010s indie space where theatrical windows were shrinking, video on demand was becoming a lifeline, and offbeat tonal mashups could find niche audiences outside the multiplex. Its scale and precision fit that moment. Small-town locations, close-up world building, a performance-forward pitch that travels better by word of mouth than by trailer fireworks. It reads like a cult candidate rather than a franchise seed, one of those titles people recommend with, "Just trust me, it's different." Within the director's body of work, it feels like a twist on familiar preoccupations. The storytelling orbits domestic spaces, kitchens, porches, classrooms, places typically coded as safe and feminine. Here those spaces are repurposed as courts of law, with etiquette standing in for statute. That pivot from nurturing to patrolling connects to a recurring fascination with caretaking and the cost of it. The film reframes maternal instincts as civic action, then quietly asks how far such instincts can go before they turn into self-appointed authority. Culturally, the movie brushes up against very current anxieties without stapling itself to headlines. The small-town setting, the emphasis on children, the impatience with slow, imperfect systems, all resonate in an era of frayed trust in institutions. But because everything is filtered through a storybook glaze, the themes arrive as parable rather than polemic. That's why it endures better than issue-driven thrillers tied to a specific news cycle. It speaks to a mood, order longed for, danger minimized, neat endings desired, more than to a single moment. As a historical artifact of style, Miss Meadows belongs to a mini-trend where retro aesthetics meet contemporary unease, pastel palettes doing dark work. You can trace its DNA alongside films that use vintage textures to estrange the present, turning familiar Americana into a stage set where modern ethics can be rehearsed. Its contribution is the most delicate of the bunch. It doesn't scream subversion, it curtsies and proceeds. In a franchise-obsessed landscape, that restraint is its historical footprint, a reminder that some stories are strongest when they arrive as a single, immaculately folded note. Here's how Miss Meadows stacks up when it comes to budget versus production quality, and how it performed financially, plus how marketing and audience reaction played into that picture. The film was made on a modest budget, around $3 million, according to production notes. For a studio-backed indie, that's tight. Yet every frame looks intentional, from the vintage dresses to the tidy suburban sets to the tap shoe choreography. It's the kind of production where nothing feels missing or compromised. Instead, the design signals artistry, not austerity. In terms of financial performance, Miss Meadows didn't break box office records. It seems to have bypassed wide theatrical success altogether, with no reported domestic or international gross. Instead, its life likely leaned on festival buzz, targeted theatrical openings, and, crucially for 2014, the growing VOD and streaming market. That means its financial story is less about ticket sales and more about cumulative returns from rental and digital buys, plus how long the film stuck in the public conversation. Marketing leaned into the tonal mashup, posters and trailers highlighting a polite schoolteacher with a gun tucked in her purse, graceful tap-tap-tap against a thriller's backdrop. That packaging did a double take on the audience, intriguing for some, confusing for others. That ambiguity may have hampered its wide reach, but it also carved out an audience that leaned into the oddness, helping it gain cult status over time. Audience reception was split. Some embraced its quirky charm and tonal boldness, while others found the tone uneven or too eccentric. Divided reactions like that can dampen box office momentum, but they also fuel long-term interest, sparking conversations and repeat viewings among those drawn to its offbeat voice. What's remarkable is how much texture the film wrings out of its lean budget. Costumes, props, production design, and a memorable performance from Katie Holmes all feel richer than the ledger says. It's an example of creative frugality. When you don't have cash for spectacle, you get exacting in details, and that exactitude becomes part of the film's personality. So budget-wise, Miss Meadows plays in the modestly financed indie with high ambition league. It didn't become a financial juggernaut, but its creative polish far outpaced its dollar cost. Whether it recouped its investment through VOD and long-tail visibility is hard to pinpoint publicly, but the result is a film that feels more sophisticated and visually coherent than most titles with 3 times its budget. Do you also want me to expand this into a more storytelling style breakdown, where I guide the audience through how budget shaped specific creative choices scene by scene? If you're curious where you can step into the strange and quirky world of Miss Meadows, the good news is that it's just a few clicks away. The film had only a very limited theatrical run when it was first released in 2014, but its true life has always been in the digital space. Instead of being locked to art house theaters or festival screens, it's been living where audiences can easily access it, on-demand platforms, streaming libraries, and digital rentals. The most common way viewers discovered Miss Meadows was through digital rental or purchase, and that continues to be the best option for those who want to experience it in full HD without distractions. Services like Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, and Google Play have all carried it in the past, making it a film you can pull up at home as easily as grabbing popcorn from your kitchen. It also circulated on subscription-based platforms, occasionally showing up in streaming libraries, which helped it quietly reach niche audiences who may never have sought it out in theaters. As for the best way to watch it, this isn't the kind of film that demands an IMAX screen or booming theater sound. Miss Meadows works best in an intimate setting, the kind where you can actually notice the details, the soft pastels of her dresses, the crisp suburban lawns that frame the darker undertones, and the delicate tap-tap of her shoes as they echo like punctuation marks in the story. Watching it on a personal screen at home allows you to tune into its tonal shifts and catch the irony between the cheery surface and the violent undercurrents. The film also benefits from repeat viewings. The first watch is about surprise, getting swept up in the tonal oddity of a prim schoolteacher who moonlights as a vigilante. The second or third watch is where you begin to see the precision in its choices, the deliberate use of costume, music, and framing. That makes owning it digitally worthwhile, since it's a film that reveals more each time. So while you won't find Miss Meadows headlining multiplexes or blockbuster marathons, you can absolutely experience it from the comfort of your couch. In fact, that's arguably the perfect way to view it, a movie that feels as cozy as tea in a floral cup, until you realize there's something sharper lurking just under the rim. Do you want me to also list the specific current streaming platforms where Miss Meadows is available right now in the USA?